From the 7th century onward, signs of recovery appear more frequently. Population seems to have grown in both northern and southern regions. Studies based on detailed estate surveys from the 9th century in Italy, southern Gaul, and the heartlands between the Seine and the Rhine show rural communities that were relatively young, mobile, and able to recover quickly from mortality spikes. Short crises did not break the long-term trend. In some of these areas, the number of people may have doubled within a few generations. A broad and uniform population boom probably did not occur before the 11th century, but there was already clear growth in older settled zones by the late 8th and 9th centuries. Densities of 20 to 30 people per square kilometer may have been reached in some regions near Paris or on the lands of major abbeys. In upland regions with harder conditions, the figures were lower but still significant. Systems of land distribution to tenants and frequent movement of peasant families allowed both more intensive farming in long-occupied areas and gradual development of rougher zones, though on a smaller scale than the great clearances of the Central Middle Ages. The sources are mainly from royal and church archives, which creates a bias. Noble families who built their wealth partly by receiving good land from great lords, and partly by pushing into marginal and sparsely populated zones, often appear in documents only when they began to found churches or monasteries, which could be as late as the 10th century. Much of their earlier activity in clearing and settling new land therefore remains invisible. The Roman state rested on a dense net of cities, roughly 2,000 in number, supported by taxes on rural production. Each city usually had public buildings such as a forum, theater, amphitheater, public baths, and later a cathedral. Cities were also the residence of local governing elites who were responsible for tax collection. Together with the two great capitals, Rome and Constantinople, these centers formed the backbone of a Mediterranean-wide political and economic system. That system could gather and move food and other supplies over long distances, feeding both large city populations and the many garrison troops stationed on frontiers. Archaeological finds from military sites along the Rhine frontier show how varied the diet of soldiers could be. Stores contained remains of many different cereals and other crops, some clearly imported from far away. By contrast, nearby farms produced only a limited range of grains. Roman authorities used both taxes and the revenues of imperial estates to run this large redistributive machine. The everyday meal of a frontier soldier was thus the result of a complex system that linked distant provinces. Since Pyrrhen's time, debates about the end of the ancient world have often centered on the regions he highlighted, especially Merovingian Gaul. New research adds Italy as a crucial test case. After Justinian's reconquest, the peninsula was split between territories held by the Eastern Empire and lands controlled by new Germanic rulers, and this mixed situation makes it a valuable laboratory for studying how the old Mediterranean system of production and exchange ended. The decline of urban life has long been a favorite topic. Many of the hundreds of cities known from classical sources seem to have shrunk or disappeared by the early Middle Ages. In the zones held by the Eastern Empire, however, most cities appear to have survived, and severe decline is less common. Several factors help explain this relative resilience. The Eastern Empire maintained a functioning network of roads, rivers, and sea routes for longer, and the old cities remained key points in this web. Although Christian buildings spread and some older monuments fell into disuse, urban centers in Imperial Italy kept three important roles: They remained core defensive sites in frontier regions. Institutions responsible for public works and services continued to function. And the urban fabric, although altered, avoided the deep breakdown and thorough ruralization that affected many Western cities outside imperial control. Rome shows how hard it is to trace step-by-step urban change. Around the year 400, the city may have had close to 500,000 people. By the 7th century, perhaps less than 1/10 of that population remained. Some scholars think Rome turned into a scattered city made up of several small clusters of settlement divided by unused land. Yet it appears that more than one area functioned as a town center, not only the zone by the river. Rome continued to act as a major consumer and commercial hub in Italy. The free grain supply for citizens under imperial rule seems to have lasted into the late 6th century. Later, in the 7th and 8th centuries, the city relied on land owned by the papacy and church institutions in the surrounding region of Latium and from Sicilian estates for its food. Archaeological finds from one excavation site show how Roman trade links shifted over time. Pottery from North Africa dominated until about 650. After Byzantine control in Africa ended, goods began to arrive mainly from the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. By the middle of the 8th century, most ceramic goods in Rome were local in origin, though influenced by styles from Constantinople. This shift matched a wider breakdown in relations between the Roman Church and Byzantine authorities. Even so, the evidence shows ongoing trade in valuable goods aimed at wealthy buyers. Large-scale international commerce did not seem to reach rural zones. This contrast does not mean Italy was split neatly between an outward-looking Byzantine center and a closed Lombard one. Regional differences matter. In the south, many bishoprics disappeared after imperial retreat. Out of 100 sees in Spoleto and Benevento, only about 10 still existed by 700. And most were tiny hill towns that would have been little more than villages in the north. Excavations in northern Italy reveal many examples of urban decline. Abandoned streets were turned into farmland, road systems fell out of use, and wooden buildings appeared inside ancient public spaces. Yet landowners did not desert the cities, as they often did farther north in Europe. Southern Gaul also stayed urban, as did most of Spain. The Lombard kingdom had its capital at Pavia, and nobles lived in towns. Lucca kept much of its Roman street plan and may have held a similar density of people. Dozens of new churches appeared between 700 and 900. Many churches and houses were built outside the old walls, including the palace of the local duke. By the 8th century, Lucca had merchants, gold workers, doctors, builders, metalworkers, tailors, and moneyers. Some residents held rural property. Church lands and secular estates were managed from the city, meaning members of the urban class owned large parts of the surrounding territory. Lucca remained dominant socially and economically, much like in late antiquity. Justinian's military recovery briefly returned Italy to the trade system of the Eastern Empire. Local raw materials continued to move to coastal centers such as Milan and Ravenna, and Mediterranean goods from Africa and the Levant still reached Italian consumers. Shipwreck counts show steady movement in the central Mediterranean during the 6th century, even if the western seas saw much less activity. Ceramic and coin patterns in Byzantine and Lombard areas differ greatly, hinting at strong borders, yet the overall pottery distribution in Genoa resembles that in Marseille. This suggests the Eastern trading system supplied both Gaul and Spain through Liguria. The sudden drop in African and Eastern imports to Frankish markets in the mid-7th century may be due to loss of Byzantine control of this region rather than a universal collapse of trade. By the 8th century, Eastern goods and Adriatic salt flowed through routes that Venice increasingly controlled. In Gaul, political power and exchange networks faced north and west rather than south. Only much later would the North Sea economy rise to global importance. From the 3rd century onward, the Roman world was already breaking into regional systems, a pattern that became central to medieval development. Across the West, many towns lost continuity. Large cities broke apart into small clusters of homes separated by abandoned spaces used for gardens and vineyards. Populations fell to hundreds or a few thousand people. Tours, once significant, shrank to 2 religious centers, one inside the old walls, one at the shrine of Saint Martin outside them. Even the residence of Charlemagne was unimpressive compared to Roman or Eastern imperial cities. In Frankish lands, authority was shown mainly at seasonal gatherings of nobles and not through cities. These assemblies did not resemble fixed capitals. This pattern differed greatly from that of the Lombards at Pavia or the Visigoths at Toledo, who had permanent courts and administrations rooted in towns. Christian communities after 400 were centered on bishops within each urban district. This religious structure helped keep parts of the Roman city network alive, even in the north. Archaeology has uncovered Roman buildings beneath later settlements, showing a thread of continuity. Survival depended on whether a bishop remained in place. Many secondary centers also endured, maintaining administrative and spiritual roles on a smaller scale. Still, early medieval cities often looked empty and ruined. Walls crumbled, monuments decayed, public buildings lost purpose, and wood replaced stone. One bright exception was religious building. Scores of churches appear in cities like Metz, Paris, Lyon, and Bordeaux. After the 7th century, major construction shifted to rural monasteries. Kings chose to live in countryside palaces rather than in old urban centers. Nobles moved between many residences, from castles to estates and monasteries. At the same time, new trading hubs emerged at the edges of Frankish territory. Monasteries in the northwest stopped sending caravans south for goods. Instead, river mouths became arrival points for merchants, sailors, and travelers from across the sea. Anglo-Saxon and Frisian traders drove the creation of new ports. 2 main settlements linked to the Franks were Quentivik and Dorestad, while across the water similar hubs rose near London, Southampton, and East Anglia. Further away, places like Dublin and Birka handled Scandinavian trade. Some sites may have been started by kings, others grew naturally, but rulers soon taxed and regulated them. Nearby workshops processed bone, leather, and metal. Market gardening also took place around these ports, while single households often made their own goods. These new trading points were unlike the old Roman cities of Italy. In the Frankish heartland, they began to decline in the early 9th century, even before Viking raids. Silt blocked harbors and trade moved elsewhere. By around 900, commercial life revived in new or older sites such as London and Utrecht. Some older ports vanished, but others like Dublin and Kiev grew larger, showing the wider trade system was still active. Power among Frankish elites was more dispersed than in the southern world. Italian cities kept strong elites who held on to urban life, and as a result, towns remained central from an early date. In the northwest, economic and elite patterns broke more fully between the 7th and 9th centuries. True urban revival took longer and did not strengthen until after 1000. Rural change must be viewed in long scale. In Provence, from the 1st century onward, land concentrated in large units producing wine, oil, and wool. These activities faded in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and wine amphora production stopped. Vineyards in the north grew instead, and agricultural markets became more regional. Even as processing centers closed, wealthy landowners continued to build churches and decorate estates. Over time, estates shifted from direct production to rent collection. The word for a landed unit changed meaning, eventually referring to territories of many sizes. Major landowners still existed in the 6th and 7th centuries, especially in Francia, but they acted more as rent collectors than as managers of farms. Large plow teams disappeared, and sharecroppers and tenants took over cultivation. Gradually, the relationship between lord and tenant changed. Rather than owning land outright, many peasants held inherited units in exchange for payment. A system of strip farming appeared, divided into small fields assigned to tenant families in rotation. Lords demanded a share of produce and labor, but possession could be passed to children. Forms of obligation evolved across regions. Some tenants owed weekly work, others owed plow service or transport. Heavy labor corvées were especially useful to landlords. By the end of the 9th century, a tenant's legal status no longer matched the type of land held. A free man working a servile unit owed servile duties. A serf on a free unit owed only free obligations. In practice, work and rent mattered more than formal status. Women played an important role too. Sources show groups of women spinning and weaving cloth in household settings and in shared workspaces. In estates of northern Francia, roughly half the population may have been free and half unfree. Yet even people of servile origin gained more stability once they were attached to a specific holding and could form households. The early manorial pattern of the Frankish core depended on mixed labor and aimed to boost cereal production on a larger scale without relying on slave gangs. Lords supplied animals to tenants so that teams could plow efficiently. This emphasis on trained plow workers explains why large ox teams became so common. Whether this system was productive is less important than understanding why it existed, why it thrived in the north, and why it appeared more weakly in the south. In the Eastern Empire, most farms became small tenant plots. The government collected taxes directly from peasant cultivators. This made military recruitment and revenue simpler. Later, large estates re-emerged, but the central pattern remained one of rent rather than direct cultivation. Transport obligations in the West formed networks linking estates to palaces, harbors, and monasteries. Goods moved along fixed routes, redistributing surplus grain and livestock. Some produce went to trade, and some supplied armies. In Italy, these routes centered on cities where goods were stored and sold. Over time, professional merchants replaced estate officials, and domain-based exchange blended into broader commerce. Royal policy shaped estate systems too. One important regulation instructed royal estates to produce goods needed by government and military. Kings collected supplies from monasteries under their protection and could transfer church lands to followers. In some regions, church tenants struggled under growing military demands. In the late 9th century, free and noble men were taxed using land units as measurement. In southern areas, estates worked differently. There, corvées and large-scale domain farming are rarely mentioned, and landlords collected rent instead. Other regions like Iceland, Brittany, and Catalonia had mostly independent peasant farmers who lived on subsistence and small surplus. Social rank existed but remained tied to village life rather than estate control. No single rural form explains growth between 400 and 1000. Prosperity rose partly because burdens eased and peasants kept more of their harvests. Growth came first through expansion of arable land in western areas. Change was slow, driven by better use of tools, soil management, and family labor. Innovations spread unevenly. The key shift was the rise of the small farm household as the active center of production. Tools known since antiquity continued to be used, but under new economic relations. As tenants gained inherited rights and protection, their work became more stable and productive. The period around 1000 marks a turning point, mainly in perception. Evidence becomes thin and must be compared carefully with earlier material. Some labor obligations faded, others survived. In certain districts, long-standing plow service continued with reduced manual work. Many old holdings were broken into smaller plots, yet traces of original units remained. New taxes based on headcounts or local facilities replaced older estate dues. By this time, the classic estate system was fading, and measurement of land changed as villages diversified. In Flanders, which later became a center of towns and industry, estates never dominated fully. The model of urban revival must therefore be widened beyond trade alone. Cities grew not only through merchants, but also through demand from elites, garrisons, church households, and craftsmen. Urban centers consumed food and raw materials, encouraging production in surrounding countryside. Trade was one part of urban life, not the single cause. Towns that grew strongest were those where power, money, worship, craft, and administration all gathered. The long development of Western economies from the 7th to 12th century shows that contact across regions never ceased. Traders, raiders, pilgrims, and marriage alliances kept networks alive. Goods, ideas, and people moved even in times of war. Over generations, family farms increased productivity with horses, soil improvement, crop diversity, and textile industry. New markets and fairs linked north and south, and large towns emerged with wage labor and craft specialization. True urban culture arose when towns concentrated wealth, authority, and identity. Citizens developed their own rules and institutions. Surplus grain, cloth, and metalwork passed through city warehouses, returned as wages, and circulated again through markets. Magnates built stone houses, churches commissioned art, and merchants sponsored shipbuilding. Urban society fed on rural output while shaping law, culture, and power. In northern regions, towns gained self-management, though elites controlled finance and trade until later social conflicts. In Italy, cities dominated early due to strong noble and clerical presence. There, new trading classes joined older elites and eventually fought for government rights, forming communes. When viewed across many centuries, the economic rise of Western Europe looks less like a sudden leap and more like a long, uneven lift. Different regions advanced at different paces. To understand town and countryside together, one must consider social change, shifting power, land use, diet, trade, and the movement of people. Urban growth and rural expansion fed one another slowly until medieval society reached a new balance. Early medieval Christianity often receives negative judgment from modern writers. It stands between two more celebrated periods, the age of the early Church Fathers and the later era of reform under powerful popes. Because of this position, many have seen early medieval belief as a flawed version of true Christianity, shaped too closely by kings and rulers, with public worship more important than inner faith. Yet this close link between church and government was actually a defining feature of the time. The well-being of kingdoms was thought to depend on honoring God openly through public ceremonies and correct religious practice. Understanding Christianity as a public force that supported rulers and protected entire peoples is essential when looking at this era. Jonas of Orleans, who lived in the 9th century, believed he lived in a time of spiritual decline. He looked back to what he imagined was a pure beginning of Christian practice. For him, the past offered models of proper behavior that could guide reform in his own day. Yet much of what he considered ancient ritual was in fact quite recent. Many customs he described as old were creative inventions of early medieval clergy. By calling them ancient, church leaders made their reforms appear legitimate and sacred. People have long imagined that Christianity possesses an unchanging core that stands outside history. Scripture and the writings of early religious leaders have been treated as fixed authorities. Over many centuries, Christian communities have drawn on these texts whenever they desired reform. Change was expressed as a return to a pure beginning rather than as something new. Because of this, historians sometimes feel drawn into debates about which version of Christianity is closest to the truth. However, for historical study, the more important task is to uncover how Christians of the past defined themselves, how their ideals shifted over time, and how claims of continuity often hide moments of significant transformation. In the 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine reportedly saw a sign of the cross in the sky before a decisive battle. This vision convinced him to favor the Christian God, and storytellers later used this event as the model for royal conversion. Later rulers outside the Roman world were described in similar ways. Conversion stories often included common elements: a Christian queen urging her husband toward baptism, a king demanding a sign of divine power, victory in battle proving the strength of the new God, and then the collective baptism of the king and his warriors. Writers presented conversion as a voluntary, honorable decision made by a leader after careful thought, followed by the rest of his people. Gregory of Tours wrote such a story about King Clovis of the Franks. He described how the king debated Christianity with his counselors and promised to convert if granted military success. After his victory, he and thousands of his followers received baptism. In England, the monk Bede later used similar patterns to tell of King Edwin of Northumbria, whose priests and nobles discussed the new faith with him until they agreed to accept baptism. These accounts linked political identity with religious unity. A people became truly a people when they shared one belief and one ritual life. When Germanic groups settled inside the Roman world, the expectation was that they would adopt the religion of the empire. Sometimes, however, they accepted different interpretations of Christianity. The Visigoths embraced a form that saw Christ as more human than divine, later judged heretical under the label Arianism. Other groups followed similar paths before eventually turning to mainstream Catholic belief. Even Clovis, later praised for pure Catholic loyalty, may have considered Arian teaching before he chose against it. Writers of the time portrayed Arianism as dangerous competition, threatening the unity of the Christian community. England, once part of the Roman Empire but less deeply Romanized than Gaul or Spain, did not immediately follow this pattern. Anglo-Saxon leaders remained pagan for generations, even though Christian communities survived among the native Britons. Missionaries sent from Rome, beginning with Augustine in 597, brought renewed Christian influence. Pope Gregory the Great encouraged the King of Kent to model himself on Constantine. Conversion in Ireland followed a different route. Christianity arrived early, but grew through monastic leadership rather than strong urban bishoprics. Over time, Irish monks developed a distinct religious culture, open to local tradition and devoted to wandering for the sake of faith. Their influence spread across Britain and the continent. The English eventually faced competing religious practices from Irish and Roman traditions, especially in how they calculated Easter. A meeting at Whitby in 664 settled the matter for the Kingdom of Northumbria. The king ruled in favor of Roman usage, claiming that one united people should pray and worship in the same way. This example reveals how rulers oversaw religious decisions. Church councils became tools for shaping public unity, just as Constantine himself had presided over major gatherings in late antiquity. Calls for unity were especially strong in Visigothic Spain. After abandoning Arian belief in the late 6th century, kings and bishops insisted that worship across the realm follow the same rules. A single rite for prayer and song symbolized a single people under one king. Roman authority was invoked as proof of correctness, yet each kingdom imagined itself the true defender of Christian tradition. The Bishop of Rome claimed a universal leadership as the successor of Peter. However, Roman influence relied heavily on the admiration of northern Christians who traveled there for inspiration. Kings from Frankish lands protected the papacy physically and politically, believing Rome must remain pure to uphold its image as a center of true belief. When Charlemagne was crowned in the year 800, he saw his vast territory as a Christian realm united by correct worship and supported by papal blessing. The idea of a chosen Christian people expanded into one universal Christian community composed of many ethnic groups. Yet this unity could also justify violence. Charlemagne's conquest of Saxony forced baptism upon an unwilling population, with executions for those who refused. Church thinkers like Alcuin were troubled by such brutality. However, even critics believed religion was essential for holding kingdoms together. If resistance threatened unity, rulers sometimes imposed belief by force, following the severe examples of Old Testament kings. The Hebrew Bible strongly influenced early medieval rulers. They saw themselves as new leaders of God's chosen people, responsible for right worship. Laws about tithes, rest days, and public behavior drew heavily from ancient scripture. Kings and bishops shared authority, but differed in responsibility. Some churchmen argued that their spiritual power was superior, but most accepted that rulers bore the greatest accountability. If crops failed or armies were defeated, people believed God had withdrawn favor due to sin, meaning public penance was required to restore stability. In the Eastern Empire, similar thinking shaped responses to disaster. After vast regions were lost to Islamic armies in the 7th century, many blamed divine anger. Some believed image worship had polluted faith and demanded purification. Imperial authorities banned icons for a time, relying instead on the cross as the only permitted symbol. Others argued that images should be honored, and conflict lasted over a century. When image worship was restored permanently, it became central to Byzantine identity. Although this struggle was more intense in the East, both halves of the Christian world believed that correct worship ensured God's protection. Christian identity also depended on defining outsiders. Jews, pagans, and heretics served as useful contrasts. Real Jewish communities were often small, yet Christian authors portrayed them vividly through biblical memory. Heresy in the West was rare, and when it appeared, it was usually among learned thinkers rather than ordinary people. Controversies over doctrines such as Christ's nature or predestination stirred intellectual circles, but rarely reached common believers. Still, writers used the image of heretics to warn against spiritual disorder and to reinforce the authority of kings and bishops. Early medieval Christianity was not a passive relic of the past, but a living system that shaped political identity, public ritual, and social behavior. Though it drew its authority from ancient texts, it constantly reinvented itself. The Christian world that formed after Rome was built from old foundations, yet it produced new structures of belief, power, and community. The third main form of the other was pagan belief. The sharp line between Christians and non-Christians was central to how new Western Christian societies saw themselves, since their story began with rulers giving up their old gods. But the writers who described paganism were not neutral observers. They were Christian clergy explaining the errors of the old ways to educated Christian readers. So they reshaped pagan religion into something their audience would recognize: organized temples, clear idols, and priests with defined roles. Bede's story of the pagan priest Coifi shows this. He describes Coifi riding a royal horse and carrying weapons when he went to tear down his own shrines. Bede then comments that this behavior had been forbidden to Coifi when he was a pagan priest. That detail reflects Christian ideas about priests who were supposed to avoid bloodshed and warfare. In the same spirit, Bishop Daniel of Winchester wrote to his former student Boniface, who was then preaching in Thuringia, explaining how to argue with non-Christians. Daniel advised not to quarrel directly, but to ask questions that would expose contradictions in their stories about the gods. If their gods are born, how can they be eternal? When did they begin? Why did they stop having children? Who ruled before them? Why do Christians live in warm, fertile lands with wine and oil, while pagans are stuck in cold northern regions? This learned classroom image of a neat, logical pagan system would not have been very practical help for Boniface among real villagers. The people he met in Hesse and Thuringia probably did not think of their beliefs in such clear, ordered categories. In Willibald's Life of Boniface, we see a more dramatic storybook scene. Boniface cutting down the sacred oak at Geismar to prove the old gods were powerless. But even this famous act comes from a long line of stories about saints destroying holy trees, going back to the life of Saint Martin by Sulpicius Severus, a hugely influential work. When we read Boniface's own letters, we see something different. Most of his work was not against pure paganism, but against forms of Christianity that had developed with odd teachings and habits after earlier missions. His strongest words about true pagan ritual actually concern Rome, where he had heard disturbing reports about people still celebrating the old Lupercalia festival for the new year. Most of his questions to popes and English friends dealt with wandering Christianity rather than untouched heathenism. For him, Distorted Christian practice was a more pressing danger than some tidy pagan theology of the sort his teacher Daniel had outlined. In many texts, paganism appears more as an idea in Christian minds than a detailed record of real behavior. Law codes from Frisian lands speak of child offerings on cold seashores, with high tide swallowing the victims. This is called pagan practice, but it does not mean there was a fully worked-out religion with a set list of gods and doctrines. Sacred places were often linked to natural sites such as groves, hills, springs, valleys, or islands, not only to build temples. Rituals involved omens, fortune-telling, and sacrifices. Such actions could easily be blended into a new religious framework and did not disappear overnight when people were baptized. For missionaries, the first goal of conversion was to change outward behavior. New believers had to stop doing certain things that were now stamped as non-Christian. A deep change in ideas and inner beliefs could come later. Baptism formulas in Old High German required people to reject named gods like Donar and Woden and all their show. But even those names and descriptions came from missionaries, not the villagers themselves. There was no neutral category of local custom in these texts. In practice, almost every social act was labeled either Christian or pagan. Anything that smelled of magic was put into the pagan box. Things like divination, protective charms, spoken spells, and simple magic tricks were everyday tools to handle fear and risk. People, whether baptized or not, might try them. In a famous collection of questions about forbidden acts, compiled by Bishop Burchard of Worms, most examples of magic involve people who almost certainly saw themselves as Christians. Many stole church oil used in sacraments and used it for spells. This does not prove a hidden pagan core, but shows how blurred the line was. The authors of these correction texts used pagan and superstition as a broad sack into which they threw a wide range of practices they disliked. By attacking this mixed bag, they sharpened what they thought counted as real Christianity. Physical evidence does not make things much clearer. Burials with grave goods might look pagan, but what if a cross is also present? Does that make the person Christian or not? The line between the two was drawn in the minds of Christian observers. Pagan territory began where Christian control seemed to end. Paganism was, above all, the label for the outer edge. It marked the border between us and them, both outside the Christian realms and within their own borders. That border existed to be crossed by missionaries, often alongside or supported by armies. From here, we can turn to how Christians built up their own sacred spaces and social differences. At the beginning of the Christian movement, there had been an ideal that God did not live in stone shrines, but was present wherever believers gathered. Over time, however, Christianity became very much a religion centered on holy places, especially the resting places of saints. From late antiquity onward, churches and relics created a new religious map that replaced the older pagan one. Visiting these places and caring for the remains of holy men and women gave bishops, abbots, and later kings strong tools for building their authority. Relics were moved with great ceremony from one place to another, and stories about their discovery and transport multiplied. These events were not only emotional and devotional moments, but also acts of power. They showed who could command the presence of the holy. Most early medieval saints were important church leaders or founders with high social rank. Biographies and miracle stories about them reinforced links between holiness and elite status. Control over a saint's cult meant access to a powerful spiritual resource that could be used to support rule, settle conflicts, and draw followers. Kings and nobles came to rely on monasteries and saintly communities for constant prayer. Rulers freed some monasteries from the normal demands of royal agents and from close episcopal control. In return, these communities promised to pray for the ruler's success and the safety of the kingdom. Later, Carolingian rulers tightened their hold on monasteries, offering even stronger protection but also deeper involvement in their internal life. The ideal was a network of pure, peaceful communities whose worship upheld the stability of the realm. Within this system, the rule of Benedict gradually took on a new role. What began as one guide among many for moderate monastic life became, in the Carolingian world and beyond, the standard pattern for serious communal prayer. Large royal abbeys full of children, guests, and complex property did not match Benedict's original small household, but church leaders used his text as a model and adapted it. Monks and nuns living under Benedict's rule were now seen as the core guardians of disciplined, round-the-clock prayer. At the same time, the difference between monks and canons had to be clarified. Monks and nuns followed a stricter path, bound to constant communal worship in enclosed spaces. Canons were clergy who lived together and prayed together, but also had pastoral duties among the people. Reform meetings in the early 9th century tried to draw a sharper line between these two groups, yet in practice they often overlapped. In many areas, religious communities, not village parishes, were the main pillars of church life. Monks, canons, and other communal clergy organized masses for the living and the dead, cared for local people, and managed vast networks of land. Over time, offering Mass for specific intentions became one of the main tasks of these communities. The service itself shifted in meaning. It was no longer only a shared remembrance of Christ's death and rising, but also a sacrifice presented for a particular purpose: good weather, peace, safe travel, victory in war, or the salvation of a dead relative. Networks of mutual remembrance grew, where groups promised to pray for one another's dead. Thick books listing the names of benefactors, friends, and rulers recorded these ties. Being included in such a book meant a share in the community's ongoing spiritual work. Women's houses also played a part in this world of prayer, even though they depended on male clergy to perform Mass. Their form of dedicated virginity was especially valued because it combined high birth, a measure of distance from everyday politics, and constant intercession. Some female communities acted with strong moral confidence. For example, there were nuns who refused to pray for a king who had cast aside his lawful wife, making clear they understood the power of withholding their support. These patterns rested on changing ideas about death and what came after. The final judgment at the end of time remained central, but many now believed that each soul faced a first judgment right after death. Those who had not fully atoned for their sins would suffer in a state of temporary punishment from which they might be freed by the prayers of the living. Visionary stories of journeys through the afterlife showed souls in pain and criticized kings and great men who had failed in their duties. Such tales warned powerful listeners that their actions on earth would be weighed, and that even they might depend on the prayers and gifts they arranged. A deep divide opened between those who lived in organized religious communities and the ordinary priests who served scattered villages. Monasteries and great churches were staffed mainly by people from rich and noble families, often given into the cloister as children, along with land that would have been their inheritance. In theory, status inside the cloister was supposed to depend on seniority and spiritual merit. In daily life, however, old social hierarchies still mattered. Servants, laborers, and dependent peasants supported the community's way of life, allowing its members to focus on liturgy and learning. Ordinary village priests, by contrast, often lived much closer to the people around them in both style and status. Many came from lowly backgrounds and served in churches founded by local lords. Their income and safety depended on those same patrons. Some priests were attached to small monastic cells or to cathedral chapters, and thus formed part of broader religious networks. Others stood almost alone in rural regions, with little contact with bishops or major houses. Their work was to baptize, marry, bury, and teach in modest settings, often sharing the hardships of their neighbors. As bishops tried to reform the clergy, they wrote lists of instructions and compiled handbooks. These texts show what was expected of rural priests. They should be literate, morally upright, and clean in their habits, particularly in matters related to sex and violence. Bishops also wanted them to be firmly under episcopal control, not merely servants of lay lords. Rulers supported these reforms, issuing orders that priests should not be beaten, thrown out of their churches, or humiliated without proper judgment. Yet some parish priests became local strongmen, using their position to build influence and resisting correction. Sexual conduct was a key battlefield in the effort to set clergy apart. The ideal that priests should not be married or sexually active had a long history. Over centuries, church leaders returned again and again to the argument that those who handle the holiest things must keep their bodies pure. In earlier times, this applied mainly to bishops and higher clergy, who performed the Eucharist only occasionally. By the early medieval period, monks and other celibate clergy were seen as a separate, higher level of Christian life. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Christian world, ordinary priests were generally allowed to marry, as long as they followed certain rules. This shows that Christian communities could make different practical choices while sharing many beliefs. All of this raises a question about the expectations of the wider population. The category lay people was still quite loose in this period. Belonging to the Christian community was first and foremost a matter of baptism. The ceremony was still public and solemn, though the focus shifted from adults to infants. Godparents took on the duty of speaking promises on behalf of the child and became spiritual kin, creating webs of relationships that could shape politics and society. Among the great of the earth, monasteries drew fascination and desire. Rulers and noble families often chose to retire to religious houses at the end of their lives, or at moments of crisis, hoping to die in a robe rather than in armor. This was seen as a safer path to salvation. For people lower down the social scale, the process of changing death customs was slower. The poor might only gradually gain access to full Christian burial with clerical rites. By the time such burials became more common, the Church could also more clearly mark out those who were denied them because of unrepented serious sin. Life between baptism and death was structured by the Christian calendar. Sundays, fast days, and saints' festivals shaped the rhythm of work and rest. Major seasons, such as Lent, were times for fasting, confession, and preparation for communion at Easter. Regular reception of the Eucharist remained rare and required serious preparation. Confession and penance, first developed inside monasteries, spread into wider society through manuals that listed sins and assigned remedies such as fasting or almsgiving. Public penance, with formal rituals of shame, was reserved for the powerful whose actions caused scandal and harmed the whole community. It is not easy to hear the voices of ordinary believers or ordinary priests behind these texts, which were mostly written by educated churchmen. But if we want to understand this world, we need to pay attention to the contrast that mattered most at the time. Not simply clergy versus laity, but the strong versus the weak. Rulers and magnates used religion to support their power, but poor people also turned to prayer, saints, and rituals for protection and hope. Marriage provides a good example of how religious practice developed in stages. Early Christian wedding blessings existed, but most of what we would now call the wedding remained a family event centered on property, alliances, and celebration. The Church most strongly insisted that marriage should be lasting, and that many types of kin were forbidden as partners. Rules against close marriage grew more complex and reached deep into noble family strategies. Like public penance, these rules could cut sharply across powerful interests. So, was early medieval Christianity simply imposed from above? It certainly had many top-down features. Kings and noble patrons fought over churches, saints, and monasteries and used them as bases of authority. But many ordinary men and women, and many lower-ranking priests, also cared deeply about what was right belief and right practice. Demands for clerical reform, stricter celibacy, and purer worship often came from those who depended on church prayer for their own salvation. The shape of Christianity in this period was the result of constant negotiation between rulers, clergy, and the wider people, all trying in their own way to live out what they thought was true faith. From the middle of the 11th century onward, major reform movements changed Western Christianity and reshaped political life. These changes later led to the conflict known as the investiture controversy. Church leaders became more confident, and church authority tried to create a sharper separation between religious power and secular rule, insisting that anything sacred belonged only to the clergy. However, these developments did not appear suddenly. They were built from older concerns that stretched back for centuries. The fight against buying church offices and the demand for pure clergy were both long-standing issues, even though they gained new force in this period. Many scholars have described the 11th century as a complete turning point, but earlier forms of Christianity had their own strength and identity, and cannot simply be dismissed as undeveloped versions of what came later. Using the year 1000 as a point of change is misleading. Religious ideas and customs shifted slowly over generations, and older habits often survived alongside newer standards. A better way to imagine this is like layers of rock pressing together, or like streams gradually feeding into a larger river. One well-known example often used to mark change is the monastic center at Cluny, founded in the early 10th century by a powerful noble. Its foundation document allowed its monks to choose their leaders freely and placed the monastery under papal authority. Later, in the mid-11th century, Cluny became an important force in new reform movements, but early research was too quick to imagine Cluny as special from the start. Over time, scholars have shown that many other monasteries shared similar qualities, and that Cluny stood within a long tradition rather than outside it. Its importance came from the way it combined existing ideas rather than from being completely new. In German lands, emperors still directed monastic reform during the 10th century, continuing older habits of royal involvement. One story tells that an emperor visiting a monastery dropped his royal staff during a service to test whether the monks would break their concentration. None did, and he was pleased. This story was retold around a century later by a monk who strongly opposed later reformers. His criticism reflects growing tension between traditional cooperation with secular rulers and newer demands for strict church independence. Meanwhile, in regions like France and Lotharingia, powerful nobles increasingly took over roles once held by kings. Reform did not happen in only one place. It grew in many religious houses, at Cluny, at Gorze, at Ghent, at Fleury, and across England, where churchmen worked closely with the king. In the late 10th century, the English monarchy made Benedict's rule the standard model for communal religious life. Similar patterns appeared in Italy, where reformers arrived by invitation to strengthen monastic discipline. The 10th century was not a dull age, but one full of intense spiritual action. Many warriors renounced violence and entered the religious life. One northern noble known for fighting bandits eventually became bishop, then a monk, then founded a small community of his own, far from worldly noise. His personal retreat soon became a monastery. His life shows how turning away from war and wealth did not break with tradition, but instead followed familiar paths into monastic seclusion. The religious world and the world of power remained linked. Kings, nobles, bishops, and abbots all moved across these boundaries, using spiritual authority to strengthen their rule and depending on monasteries for prayer and support. This connection had deep roots and had been forming since late antiquity. These ties later came under pressure during reform movements after his time, but the relationships between sacred and secular power had been shaped over many centuries. The long process that reshaped Christian thought and church authority still needs much more study. The changes of the 11th century were not sudden eruptions, but the outcome of steady, layered development that reached far back into earlier centuries. In the year 400, the high culture of Western Europe and the Mediterranean was Roman and imperial, at least for the ruling classes. We can imagine this world through a rich silver dish, showing the Emperor Theodosius sitting in state with his sons and bodyguards, made a little earlier in the same period. It was probably a gift from the emperor to an important official. Around the year 1000, a much smaller group of people lived in a culture that was still Roman and imperial in style. A good example is the portrait of the Saxon Emperor Otto III in a Gospel book, where he is shown enthroned, while symbolic female figures representing Rome, Gaul, Germany, and the Slavic lands approach him. The picture uses many classical visual ideas and was meant to signal a renewal of the Roman idea of empire. But its meaning is very different from the ancient models, not least because it appears inside a Christian book of the Gospels, not on a secular object. The cultural development between those two objects is complicated. Still, it can be roughly divided into 5 broad phases: the last decades of the Western Roman Empire, which set the foundations for later developments, the time of the barbarian successor kingdoms, the separate path followed by Spain, after most of it was taken over by Islam, the so-called Carolingian Renaissance of the late 8th and 9th centuries, and finally the Ottonian renewal of the 10th century. If we only follow these periods one after another, it is easy to ignore the things that remained the same across them. Yet the changes in Western European culture between 400 and 1000 were so deep that we must pay serious attention to each distinct phase, not only to the long-term continuities. In the last century of the Western Roman Empire, politics were unstable and often violent. The Visigoths and Vandals entered imperial territory and caused serious damage. However, the official cultural picture still tried to present calm and order. Some writers, especially in Gaul and Spain, described invasions and civil wars in detail. Others chose to avoid giving any sense of collapse, and instead focused on order, morality, and stability. Even so, imperial culture was not frozen. New things appeared at the imperial court. The general Stilicho, who had barbarian ancestry, was shown on a carved ivory panel, wearing long trousers, a style that had been banned in Rome a few years earlier. Another major change was the move of the western capital from Milan to Ravenna, when Honorius shifted his residence there to enjoy the protection of the surrounding marshes. Ravenna gained grand imperial buildings, particularly under the influence of Honorius's sister, Galla Placidia. She built a palace chapel dedicated to John the Evangelist to thank God for saving her and her young son from a deadly storm at sea as they traveled back from Constantinople to claim the throne. The chapel's decoration included portraits of Christian emperors and a vivid image of the storm that had nearly killed them. She also founded a Church of the Holy Cross with a nearby Chapel of Lawrence. An official chronicle from Ravenna, known only from a later copy, recorded events there with symbolic pictures in the margins. It showed, for example, stylized images of earthquakes and the severed heads of traitors who had been executed. Strikingly, it said nothing about barbarian invaders. The art of Ravenna, a recently enriched city like Constantinople had once been, presented it as a proper imperial center, defeating internal enemies and ignoring foreign threats. Ravenna became the Western capital and later drew important rulers such as Charlemagne and Otto III, who admired its monuments. Imperial art as a whole aimed to project strength and permanence, almost to the point of stiffness. Besides buildings, there were statues and many official portraits of emperors in public spaces, much like modern states that hang leaders' photographs in government offices. Imperial power also appeared in gift-giving ceremonies at the court. On New Year's Day, at the start of a consul's term, on birthdays and anniversaries, emperors distributed precious silver dishes and other luxuries, each matched to the status of the receiver. High officials might receive fine brooches, and similar items could be sent as diplomatic gifts beyond the imperial borders. This court culture also appears clearly in written texts. The prefaces to laws are full of imperial language and praise of the emperor's justice. Another important form was the panegyric, speeches in prose or verse in honor of a ruler or new consul. Orators such as Symmachus or the poet Claudian delivered them. These speeches often explained imperial policies and could even include mild criticism, but they were wrapped in traditional Roman myths and flattering imagery. The court and the empire's upper classes shared one main literary culture. Education for the elite focused on grammar and rhetoric. Training in speaking and writing well prepared a man for both high office and for the ideal of cultivated leisure. Working in public life was seen as a necessary duty, even though the highest ideal was to enjoy peace and study. Well-born senators were expected to be widely read. They could show their learning in government, in law courts, in their private libraries, and perhaps most of all in their letters. Letters helped to maintain friendships and social networks, which were central to the life of the late Roman aristocracy. This literary world had deep roots going back at least to the late Republic. It continued almost unchanged despite the Christianization of the empire. The Bible, which became central to the new religion, did not meet classical standards of style, but this did not make educated Christians turn their backs on literature. Instead, they sometimes reworked biblical stories into polished Latin verse. Jerome, the great translator of the Bible into Latin, wrote with refined style and worried about his love of classical authors. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most important Christian thinkers, had trained as a rhetorician and had worked in the imperial court. His theology drew on rhetorical techniques and on philosophical ideas taken from Platonism. Together with Ambrose of Milan and Basil of Caesarea, Jerome and Augustine were leading church writers of the 4th and 5th centuries. Their works, especially biblical commentaries, shaped most early medieval learning. Augustine, like Jerome, was also a prolific letter writer, and Paulinus of Nola used letters and poetry to reshape older ideals of friendship into a Christian language of spiritual love. The court and the aristocracy were joined by this shared literary culture, which gives us a picture of a refined and educated late Roman world. Yet this picture can distract us from the constant role of military force. Armed power became most visible during civil wars or when barbarian attacks grew too strong to control. But it was always present in the background. We can see it in the soldiers guarding Theodosius in imperial art, in the weapons and military brooches shown on images of Stilicho, in the massive gates and walls of frontier cities such as Trier, and in the defensive walls of Rome and Constantinople built during crises. We also see it in the many military belt buckles found in graves near the frontiers, which later influenced the equipment of barbarian warriors. By removing most citizens from military service and concentrating troops at the borders, the empire had separated civilian and military life to some degree. But this separation weakened in the 5th century as crises grew. Roman culture was not only formed by Latin and Greek speakers. Other languages survived in the provinces. Some, like Coptic and Syriac, continued in use, especially in religious circles and among groups that stood on the edge of mainstream church life, including some ascetics and dissidents. This shows how Christianity itself could split into many local forms, each shaped by language, beliefs, and the cults of specific saints. Some scholars speak of many small, local Christian worlds. In the Western regions, written traces of such regional languages appear around the year 600, later than in the East. This may partly reflect the loss of documents, but it also suggests that, unlike the peoples of the Middle East, the Celts had not previously developed strong written traditions. After the decline of Roman court culture, however, Celtic areas such as parts of Britain and Ireland developed their own literary and artistic styles. Most of the kingdoms that replaced Roman rule in the West tried in some way to continue or imitate imperial forms. The Ostrogoths, who settled in Italy in the late 5th century, took Ravenna as their capital. Their king Theodoric built on what earlier Roman rulers had done. Because the Goths, including their king, followed Arian Christianity, which had a different understanding of the Trinity from the mainstream church, they did not use the existing Catholic churches in the city. Instead, they built their own cathedral, baptistry, and royal chapel, richly decorated with mosaics. These images seem to have included portraits of Theodoric and his court, set against scenes of Ravenna's palace and harbor. When imperial forces from Constantinople later conquered the city, they altered some of these mosaics, removing Gothic figures and replacing them with images that honored the new emperor. They also created the famous images of the emperor and empress with their courts in the Church of San Vitale. That building later impressed the planners of Charlemagne's palace chapel at Aachen. The Ostrogothic court also adopted Roman-style government. Theodoric kept many Roman institutions and offices, and one of his leading officials, Cassiodorus, later collected his official letters as examples for future administrators. These letters show how the Ostrogoths used Roman methods to rule Italy. At the same time, old aristocratic literary traditions survived. Boethius, a member of the Roman elite who served under Theodoric, was one of the last major Latin philosophers of antiquity. In addition to writing his famous Consolation of Philosophy while in prison awaiting execution, he translated parts of Aristotle and composed technical works on music, mathematics, and theology. Other barbarian kingdoms did not inherit a major capital city, so they had to build on the practices of regional Roman administration rather than on central imperial structures. The Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, and the Burgundians all followed this path. A letter from the Bishop of Rheims to the Frankish king Clovis congratulates him on taking over the government of a Roman province, showing how older structures continued under new rulers. Some barbarian kings even admitted, in official letters, that they were formally subordinate to the emperor in Constantinople, but that did not stop them from behaving like small emperors themselves. The Frankish king Theudebert I once issued gold coins in his own name, and another king, Chilperic, had large decorated dishes made with proud inscriptions, similar to earlier imperial gifts. The Merovingian rulers of the Franks were not simply uneducated warriors. They could read and write, and some letters survive from their court in the eastern Frankish lands. More broadly, there was a continuous tradition of aristocratic letter writing in Gaul, running from the late Roman period into the time of the successor kingdoms. Bishops and nobles such as Sidonius Apollinaris, his relatives Ruricius and Avitus, and the later Desiderius of Cahors all maintained this practice. Poets also continued to write flattering verses and occasional pieces in honor of kings and nobles, as we see in the works of Venantius Fortunatus at the end of the 6th century. In Spain, a strong royal court emerged again under the Visigoths in the later 6th century. They had already tried to copy the imperial model when King Atholf married the emperor's sister, Galla Placidia, early in the 5th century. Later, King Leovigild created royal insignia and founded a new city named after his son, echoing imperial city building. Another king, Requeswens, built a small royal chapel that still stands and donated a richly worked gold crown to a church, evidence of a tradition of royal offerings described in earlier sources. The ideology of the Visigothic court in the later 6th and 7th centuries appears more in church councils and in the histories written by bishops and scholars than in private letters. Authors like Isidore of Seville and Julian of Toledo used their works to present the Visigothic monarchy as legitimate heirs of Rome and defenders of the faith. The Lombards entered Italy later than the other barbarian groups, but they too absorbed elements of imperial style. A famous example is the decorated visor of a king's helmet, which shows the ruler in a proud, formal stance. Their palaces in cities like Milan, Pavia, and Monza are only known through later descriptions, especially by the writer Paul the Deacon. In Anglo-Saxon England, the influence of imperial culture was weaker still. Britain had never been deeply Romanized, and the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons was spread out over a long and destructive period. Yet traces of imperial imagery persist, for example in the way Bede described the Northumbrian king Edwin, drawing on Roman models of kingship. Thus, the courts of the successor kingdoms in the West kept some echoes of imperial style. Even more clearly, Papal Rome preserved and reshaped the Roman heritage. While Ravenna became the practical seat of the Western court, Rome remained the symbolic imperial city. In the emperor's absence, the popes increasingly presented themselves as the guardians and heirs of this great past. For the papacy, Rome was above all the city of the apostles Peter and Paul. In late antiquity, a great church was built over Peter's grave on the Vatican Hill, and another over Paul's tomb outside the city walls. Later, popes added many more churches at the burial places of martyrs. Their building projects and donations were carefully recorded in a book of papal biographies that runs from the 6th to the 9th centuries. Some popes focused on building churches for pilgrims over catacombs on the outskirts of the city. Gregory the Great did not build much, but he redesigned the crypt of St. Peter's and was hugely important in other ways, in his biblical commentaries, in his management of church lands, in his defense of Rome, and in his mission to convert the Anglo-Saxons in England. The popes also claimed the imperial past by reusing older buildings in the city. One pope turned a former official audience hall into a church with a splendid mosaic of Christ at his return in glory. Another transformed a ceremonial hall near the Palatine Hill into a church dedicated to Mary, whose wall paintings now provide a rare sequence of early medieval art. A later pope converted the old Senate House itself into a church, and another consecrated a famous pagan temple to Christian worship, turning it into a Church of Mary. In all these ways, the papacy both Christianized Rome and symbolically took over its imperial legacy. Kings and popes, then, drew heavily on Roman traditions, and the remaining aristocracies around them continued to value classical literary culture. Yet beneath this surface, real change was underway. Many of the great urban schools that had once taught grammar and rhetoric seem to have disappeared by around 500. Gaul, which had produced famous teachers and orators in the 4th century, largely lost this educational network. Only a few public orators are recorded afterward. Public speaking survived mainly in church sermons. Some preachers, like Caesarius of Arles, deliberately used plain language in order to reach ordinary hearers. In Italy, traditional schooling survived somewhat longer. Writers praised Rome and Milan as centers of learning, and high-level education must also have been available in Ostrogothic Ravenna, since royal women there were known to be well educated. But the long wars between imperial and Gothic forces, and later the Lombard invasions, damaged cities and weakened their resources. They could no longer easily support professional teachers. With the collapse of the imperial court and administration, the state no longer required large numbers of trained rhetoricians. The reward for mastering classical rhetoric therefore declined. Education shifted into church institutions. Basic reading skills were taught at local churches using the Bible, especially the Psalms, as main texts. More advanced learning was found in episcopal households and, increasingly, in monasteries. Even before the Gothic Wars, Cassiodorus had imagined setting up a Christian center of higher learning in Rome with papal support. When that plan failed, he founded a monastery on his estates in southern Italy. There he wrote biblical commentaries and other works, encouraged the copying of books, and created a handbook that guided his monks through the main texts of Christian and classical learning. Others also tried to save important knowledge from the past. In early 7th century Spain, Isidore of Seville wrote a huge reference work that summarized many fields of classical learning for later generations. Other monks compiled collections of useful quotations from earlier authors, especially the Church Fathers, so that readers could quickly find texts on particular themes. Cassiodorus's move into monastic education reflected a wider trend. Monasteries became increasingly important as centers of learning and spirituality. The monastic ideal had started in Egypt in the 4th century, where men and women withdrew into solitude or communities to seek a holy life. Stories about these monks and nuns traveled west and inspired similar experiments, first in Gaul and then elsewhere. A network of monasteries grew up under different leaders and rules. The text known as the Rule of Benedict, written in Italy in the 6th century, was only one of many sets of guidelines, and it took a long time before it became dominant. In the 5th to 7th centuries, monastic life did not create a single unified Christian culture. Instead, its great variety echoed the regional character of post-Roman culture more broadly. This regional character had its positive sides. Britain provides a good example. The first long historical text that survives from Western Britain is by a cleric called Gildas, written in the early 6th century. Earlier, the island had produced the theologian Pelagius, who left for Italy and made his mark in Rome, and the missionary Patrick, whose letters tell us about his work in Ireland. Gildas, by contrast, seems to have remained in Britain, and maybe later moved to Brittany. His Latin is polished and shows that he had a good education. He resembles moral writers in Gaul who criticized the sins of their society. But he wrote from within a specific region, condemning the sins of his own leaders and explaining disasters as divine punishment. Gildas is one of the earliest authors in the West to offer a regional view of history, but he was soon followed by others. Brief records of events had already been compiled by authors such as Hydatius in Spain. Later, writers like Gregory of Tours and Fredegar in Gaul, Isidore in Spain, Bede in Northumbria, and Paul the Deacon in Italy all wrote histories that focused on particular lands or peoples. Jordanus produced a history of the Goths from a viewpoint close to Constantinople. Modern scholars rightly insist that each of these authors had his own goals and should not simply be labeled as the first writers of national history. Still, the fact remains that they chose to look at the past from within specific regions or communities, even when they believed that God's plan guided events. In contrast, historians in the Eastern Empire, like Procopius and Agathias, could still write histories of a unified Roman Empire centered on Constantinople. Regional differences also shaped the growing world of saints' stories. It is not even clear how many such texts were written in this period. In Visigothic Spain, only a small number of lives of saints survive, and post-Roman Italy also has relatively few. Gregory the Great wrote his Book of Miracle Stories, partly because he thought there were too few written accounts of holy people in his own time. At first glance, the Frankish lands look very different, because a lot of the texts about Merovingian saints have been edited and published. But we cannot be sure how much of this material was actually written before the middle of the 8th century. For the 6th century, we have a large body of saints' stories from Gregory of Tours and Venantius Fortunatus. In Gregory's view, the Frankish world was full of shrines where holy people were buried, each one giving access to divine power and usually linked to a local cult, which, in his opinion, should ideally be managed by clergy. Each shrine, in its own way, formed a tiny local Christian world. But Gregory's way of seeing things may not have been widely shared. He may have shaped his stories to strengthen church authority more than to describe reality. Some people clearly doubted the power of saints. Still, his writings open a window on a religious landscape that was even more local and fragmented than the one a classical writer like Pausanias had seen in Greece. By the 7th century, many saints' lives were less focused on miracles and more on politics, as in the accounts of the deaths of bishops such as Praectus of Clermont and Leodegar of Autun. Many of the changes described so far happened inside the existing Roman cultural frame. Even histories of Germanic peoples and kingdoms were mostly written in Latin and from a Roman angle. At the same time, the new Germanic rulers brought their own traditions and also versions of Roman customs they had already reshaped before entering the empire. These elements added further variety. It is, however, difficult to say exactly what is Germanic and what is not, apart from some types of archaeological objects. Most of the barbarians were only converted to Christianity after they had crossed into Roman territory, and we have very little solid information about their earlier pagan beliefs. Older scholars liked to combine the 1st century account of Germanic religion given by Tacitus with the much later Icelandic stories written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century. From this mix, they created the idea of a single, unified Germanic paganism. The small amount of reliable evidence we have today suggests that this is misleading. Beliefs and practices seem to have varied a great deal from place to place. A similar problem surrounds early Germanic heroic poetry. The greatest surviving example, the Old English poem Beowulf, exists in only one manuscript, written around the year 1000. The poem, or an earlier version of it, may have been composed much earlier, but we cannot say for sure when the story first arose, or whether its references to the age of migrations reflect real events. Some scenes from Germanic legendary stories can be recognized in art, on metalwork and stone, and on the 8th century Anglo-Saxon whalebone Frank's casket. That box clearly shows the story of Wayland the Smith, but Wieland appears side by side with the Virgin and Child, and other panels show scenes such as Romulus and Remus with the she-wolf and the sack of Jerusalem by the Roman general Titus. Even here, Germanic, Roman, and Christian elements are tightly interwoven. Even if we are cautious about labeling things as Germanic, 2 points are fairly secure. First, the Germanic settlers changed the languages of the regions where they settled. The degree of change varied. It was strongest in what would become England, especially in the east, and in the lands along the Rhine. It was weaker further south, closer to the Mediterranean. The newcomers also influenced artistic styles, especially in patterns of decoration. Second, the new peoples came from warrior societies, and their arrival forced the Romans themselves to mobilize and fight more directly. As a result, the old separation between civilian and military spheres in the Roman world began to break down. In some areas, the new situation encouraged local people to revive older pre-Roman traditions. In the upland regions of Britain, for example, communities went back to building hill forts. These new forts were smaller than those of the pre-Roman Iron Age and seemed to reflect different forms of social organization. The tough, fighting spirit of the post-Roman age is captured in the heroic poem known as the Gododin, which seems to have taken shape in the 6th century and celebrates a doomed war band. The Germanic settlers were not the only outsiders who changed the culture of the former Roman West. Ireland had never been conquered by Rome, but Roman influence reached it most strongly just as the Western Empire was collapsing through Christian missionaries. The result was a distinct Celtic Christian culture. It was long thought radically different from other forms of Christianity, though modern scholars see more overlap than earlier generations did. Some have compared early Irish society to that of ancient Israel, noting similarities between Irish law and the legal sections of the Old Testament. It is now clear that these parallels partly reflect Irish borrowing from biblical books such as Leviticus, rather than a deep, independent likeness. Irish Christianity in the 6th century was strongly ascetic. It drew on Eastern models of desert monasticism, likely transmitted through Gaul. Irish churchmen also promoted a form of private penance based on written tariff books called penitentials, which listed sins and fixed penances. This system seems to have been borrowed from the British Church. What made Irish traditions especially important abroad was another custom: the pilgrimage for Christ, where individuals seeking salvation chose to leave homeland and family behind, following the gospel command to abandon father and mother. Around the year 590, a man from Leinster named Columbanus did exactly this. He left Ireland and settled first in the Frankish kingdom, founding the great monastery of Luxeuil, and later moved to Italy, where he founded Bobbio. In the generations after him, Luxeuil and the related monastery of Corbie in northern Gaul became key cultural centers, especially through their work in producing manuscripts. The script and letter forms developed in Corbie influenced the later creation of Carolingian writing styles. Columbanus is often described as a missionary, and his foundations certainly helped spread Christianity more deeply into the countryside. But he was above all a holy man and strict monk, whose presence energized existing monastic traditions in Gaul and Italy. He was not the only Irishman to raise standards of monastic discipline or to challenge kings on moral grounds. Missionary work was usually not the main purpose of these wandering Irishmen, though there were important exceptions. Aidan, for example, taught and preached in Northumbria under King Oswald, and later Virgil of Salzburg played a major role in organizing missionary activity in eastern Bavaria and Carinthia. The Irish themselves were less central to the long-term idea of organized mission than the people they inspired. The Anglo-Saxons, who had been converted through missions from Rome, Gaul, and Ireland, came to believe that they had a duty to preach to their cousins on the continent, often underestimating how Christian those areas already were. This sense of mission appears clearly in the great historical work of Bede, who gives the first extended narrative of how a whole people came to be Christian. Bede is a striking example of the state of learning at the start of the 8th century, even if he is far from typical. He lived in a double monastery, Wearmouth Jarrow, founded by Benedict Biscop, with strong support from the Northumbrian king Ecgfrith. The community followed a monastic rule influenced by Benedict's, but not identical to it. It had an impressive library, built up through book-collecting journeys to the continent. This allowed Bede to write biblical commentaries of such depth and quality that later readers saw him as the last of the ancient church fathers. Drawing on information gathered from contacts all over the islands, he also produced a learned treatise on time and the calendar, in which he included the first clear explanation in Latin of how tides work. Bede was connected with many other monasteries, including Lindisfarne, whose monks asked him to write a life of their saint, Cuthbert. Another monument made in honor of Cuthbert shows, even more clearly than Bede's texts, how mixed early medieval culture could be. The Lindisfarne Gospels, a richly decorated book of the 4 Gospels, were produced there. Their scribe had access to at least one book from Wearmouth Jarrow, since the portrait of Matthew closely follows an image of the scribe Ezra in a 6th century Italian Bible once owned by Cassiodorus and later brought north by Benedict Biscop. At the same time, the Lindisfarne Gospels contain dense decorative pages filled with intricate patterns drawn from Germanic and Celtic art, especially metalwork designs. Together with other great gospel books from Ireland and Britain, this manuscript shows how many different influences, Roman, Irish, Anglo-Saxon, and more, met in the successor kingdoms of the West. Despite the existence of a shared upper-class culture that looked back to the 4th century, the most striking feature of the post-Roman world was still its variety. The mix of influences differed from region to region. In the Frankish monastery of Echternach, founded for the Anglo-Saxon Willibrord, insular and continental traditions blended. The Trier Gospels from this house show both the animal-shaped initials favored by Frankish scribes, often using fish forms, and the intricate ornament typical of insular books. Similar styles appear in other Frankish liturgical manuscripts of the 8th century. A comparable pick-and-choose approach can be seen in stone sculpture, both in England and on the continent. The half-underground chapel, known as the Hypogée des Dunes at Poitiers, for example, contains figure carvings of the crucifixion, angels, and the Eastern pillar Saint Simeon, alongside what look like protective images of interlaced fish and a long carved curse. This mix of elements shows just how lively and creative the culture of the British Isles and northern Francia was. In the southern half of Europe, culture remained closer to older Roman forms. That does not mean it was dead. Rather, it served as a storehouse of texts, images, and motifs that others constantly drew upon. In Spain, the cultural path changed sharply after the early 8th century. The rise of Islam did not immediately alter developments in most of the West, but when Muslim forces defeated the Visigothic kingdom in 711, the Islamic world became a direct presence in Western Europe. Islam brought its own forms of learning, study of the Quran, stories and rules about the Prophet, and Islamic law. These traditions were themselves diverse, shaped by political struggles within the Muslim world. When a new dynasty, the Abbasids, overthrew the Umayyads in the east, one surviving member of the old family escaped and took control of Muslim Spain. Under him and his successors, the region remained closely tied to the wider Islamic world, but also went its own way in some matters, such as the legal school it followed. Scholars from Al-Andalus traveled east to learn, especially in fields like astronomy, and then adapted this knowledge to local needs back home. Some of this found its way into calendars and other practical texts. The Umayyad rulers in Spain long dreamed of their lost position as universal caliphs. In Córdoba, they tried to create a capital that echoed Damascus, especially by expanding and embellishing the Great Mosque over several generations. Court writers praised the city as though it were far larger and grander than archaeology suggests it really was. Even so, the ruins of the royal palace of Madinat al-Zahra, built outside Córdoba by Abd al-Rahman III when he claimed the caliphal title, show just how impressive Umayyad building could be. Drawing on information gathered from contacts all over the islands, he also produced a learned treatise on time and the calendar, in which he included the first clear explanation in Latin of how tides work. Bede was connected with many other monasteries, including Lindisfarne, whose monks asked him to write a life of their saint, Cuthbert. Another monument made in honor of Cuthbert shows, even more clearly than Bede's texts, how mixed early medieval culture could be. The Lindisfarne Gospels, a richly decorated book of the four Gospels, were produced there. Their scribe had access to at least one book from Wearmouth Jarrow, since the portrait of Matthew closely follows an image of the scribe Ezra in a 6th century Italian Bible once owned by Cassiodorus and later brought north by Benedict Biscop. At the same time, the Lindisfarne Gospels contain dense decorative pages filled with intricate patterns drawn from Germanic and Celtic art, especially metalwork designs. Together with other great gospel books from Ireland and Britain, this manuscript shows how many different influences, Roman, Irish, Anglo-Saxon, and more, met in the successor kingdoms of the West. Despite the existence of a shared upper-class culture that looked back to the 4th century, the most striking feature of the post-Roman world was still its variety. The mix of influences differed from region to region. In the Frankish monastery of Echternach, founded for the Anglo-Saxon Willibrord, insular and continental traditions blended. The Trier Gospels from this house show both the animal-shaped initials favored by Frankish scribes, often using fish forms, and the intricate ornament typical of insular books. Similar styles appear in other Frankish liturgical manuscripts of the 8th century. A comparable pick-and-choose approach can be seen in stone sculpture, both in England and on the continent. The half-underground chapel known as the Hypogée des Dunes at Poitiers, for example, contains figure carvings of the Crucifixion, angels, and the Eastern pillar Saint Simeon, alongside what look like protective images of interlaced fish and a long carved curse. This mix of elements shows just how lively and creative the culture of the British Isles and northern Francia was. In the southern half of Europe, culture remained closer to older Roman forms. That does not mean it was dead. Rather, it served as a storehouse of texts, images, and motifs that others constantly drew upon. In Spain, the cultural path changed sharply after the early 8th century. The rise of Islam did not immediately alter developments in most of the West, but when Muslim forces defeated the Visigothic kingdom in 711, the Islamic world became a direct presence in Western Europe. Islam brought its own forms of learning, study of the Quran, stories and rules about the Prophet, and Islamic law. These traditions were themselves diverse, shaped by political struggles within the Muslim world. When a new dynasty, the Abbasids, overthrew the Umayyads in the east, one surviving member of the old family escaped and took control of Muslim Spain. Under him and his successors, the region remained closely tied to the wider Islamic world, but also went its own way in some matters, such as the legal school it followed. Scholars from Al-Andalus traveled east to learn, especially in fields like astronomy, and then adapted this knowledge to local needs back home. Some of this found its way into calendars and other practical texts. The Umayyad rulers in Spain long dreamed of their lost position as universal caliphs. In Córdoba, they tried to create a capital that echoed Damascus, especially by expanding and embellishing the great mosque over several generations. Court writers praised the city as though it were far larger and grander than archaeology suggests it really was. Even so, the ruins of the royal palace of Madinat al-Zahra, built outside Córdoba by Abd al-Rahman III when he claimed the caliphal title, showed just how impressive Umayyad building could be. The Umayyads also worried about the lack of written history to support their claims to legitimacy. Although earlier generations had produced some historical and biographical works, many had been lost or survived only in later collections of short life stories. The Caliph al-Hakam II tried to remedy this by promoting the study of history and genealogy, but some of the traditions he encouraged were based on unreliable material. He also built up a huge library in Córdoba, which was later purged by a zealous minister. Most of our information about Umayyad Spain focuses on Córdoba. We know far less about other cities. This is true for both Muslim and Christian communities. Our view of Christian life under Muslim rule has long been shaped by texts connected with a martyr movement in Córdoba in the mid-9th century, written by Eulogius and his friend Paul Alvar. At first glance, these works suggest sharp hostility between Christians and Muslims, but this is misleading. It is clear that many Christians did not support the martyr movement and saw it as dangerous and unnecessary. Church councils still met, and monasteries continued to exist near Córdoba. Recognizing that Eulogius and Alvar do not represent all Christians in the region forces us to rethink how threatened Christianity really was under the Umayyads and how quickly people converted to Islam. It also raises questions about how many churches were actually built or rebuilt under Muslim rule, since some buildings once dated firmly to the Visigothic period may in fact belong to later centuries. Further north in Spain, in the Christian kingdom of Asturias, attitudes hardened over time. This region, along with other parts of the north and center, had never been fully conquered by Muslim forces, although it suffered raids. Earlier, Galicia had been a marginal area in the Visigothic kingdom, but after the Muslim takeover of the south, it became a key region in Christian Spain. One of the earliest important works from this northern world was a commentary on the Book of Revelation, written by a monk named Beatus in the late 8th century at a monastery on the edge of the high Picos Mountains. His library gave him access to many earlier church writers. Whether he connected the rise of Islam directly with the end times is unclear, since he does not name Muslims. He does, however, speak of Spain's evangelization by Saint James, who would later become the symbol of armed resistance against Muslims. Some illustrated copies of Beatus's work, which may have been first produced in Asturian circles, contain images that seem to connect Muslims with apocalyptic themes. Strong anti-Muslim feelings appear more openly in texts from the court of King Alfonso III, such as the so-called Prophetic Chronicle, which confidently predicted the expulsion of Muslims from Spain in the late 9th century. Asturian culture is even more visible in its buildings than in its books. After Alfonso II made Oviedo his capital at the end of the 8th century, a series of churches were built there, including the Church of San Julian de los Prados, whose faded but still visible wall paintings show painted arcades that open onto scenes of churches beyond, creating an illusion of space. This decoration style goes back to late antique models in places like Ravenna and Thessaloniki. At the center of the scheme stands a jeweled cross, echoing the splendid golden cross known as the Cross of the Angels, which Alfonso commissioned. A century later, another royal cross, the Cross of Victory, was made, showing how important such symbols had become in Asturian royal ideology. Another Asturian king, Ramiro I, built a group of royal buildings on a nearby hill, Monte Naranco. Although it is hard to match the surviving structures exactly with the written records of what he built, it is clear that the sculptors who worked there had seen late Roman ivory carvings and Sasanian metalwork, which inspired their designs. As with the earlier successor states, Ramiro's court art drew eclectically on many different sources. While these developments were taking place in Spain, the Carolingians were consolidating their power in the Frankish world and extending it into Italy and Saxony. With their rise came a renewed court culture that consciously reinterpreted the Christian Roman Empire. Some features of what we call the Carolingian Renaissance originated in the monastic culture of late 7th century Francia. One hallmark was a new, clear hand for copying books, now called Caroline minuscule, which grew out of earlier late Merovingian scripts and drew on older Roman letter shapes. Another was the revival of monastic life based on the rule of Benedict, which missionaries like Boniface strongly promoted. The scholar Alcuin, later a key figure at Charlemagne's court, had been trained at York in northern England, where he studied the works of Bede. The Carolingian cultural revival was not created from nothing, but it was encouraged and directed strongly by Charlemagne himself, without whom it would probably have taken a very different form or remained local. Despite earlier efforts by figures like Boniface and the Bishop Chrodegang of Metz, the first clear sign of a broad cultural program came in 789 with Charlemagne's long directive known as the Admonitio Generalis. Addressed to both churchmen and secular officials, it drew first on church councils from late Roman times to lay down basic rules for clergy and laity, and then on the Bible to set a model for Christian conduct. At the start, it presented the Old Testament King Josiah as an example of how a ruler should inspect and correct his people. Charlemagne was not the first ruler to look to the Bible for models. Earlier Roman emperors and post-Roman kings had been compared to figures such as Moses or the priest-king Melchizedek. But the Carolingians took this further, using Old Testament royal figures such as David and Josiah as constant points of comparison. Much of the Admonitio Generalis simply restated existing church and biblical rules. Yet it also introduced practical instructions about education. Schools were to teach the Psalms, writing or notation, calendar calculation, and grammar. Books, especially Gospels, Psalters, and service books, were to be copied accurately. Later, another directive on cultivating letters again linked good Latin and good reading with proper understanding of Scripture. This stress on schooling and texts lay at the heart of Carolingian culture. Careful Latin, corrected biblical texts, and reliable liturgical books were central goals. Monasteries and scriptoria across the empire worked hard to produce accurate copies of the Bible. The situation with the liturgy was more complex, because earlier there had been many different regional rites in the West. Charlemagne tried to move toward a more unified practice by obtaining a Roman Mass book from the Pope and by supporting later efforts to impose a single monastic rule based on Benedict's text, especially at the Council of Aachen in the time of Louis the Pious. These reforms were meant to make the Frankish realm more pleasing to God. Right belief and right ritual, expressed clearly and as uniformly as possible, were seen as vital to the health of the kingdom. Problems in the Byzantine Empire over religious images gave this a sharper edge. Fierce debates there over whether icons should be venerated or destroyed led Western theologians to distance themselves from both extremes. A major Carolingian text, sometimes called the Caroline Books, criticized Byzantine positions and set out a Western view that accepted the use of images as teaching tools but rejected offering them worship. Carolingian involvement in Italy, especially after the conquest of the Lombard Kingdom in 774, brought them into regular contact and conflict with Byzantium, which still held parts of southern Italy and claimed rights over Rome. Support for the papacy and closer ties to Rome were therefore not only religious acts, but also political moves against the Eastern Empire. When the Pope crowned Charlemagne as emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800, this symbolized a new Western imperial order. These Italian links and the new imperial ideal deeply influenced Carolingian cultural choices. Alongside Scripture, Rome itself, its language, literature, and monumental past, was a main foundation of Carolingian culture. The Carolingians' renewed interest in Roman authors such as Donatus and Priscian for grammar, and their monasteries copied and preserved most of the classical Latin works that survive today. They also revived late Roman literary forms, court poetry, epic and occasional, and extensive letter writing. Figures such as Alcuin and Lupus of Ferrières stand out as major authors. The social world that supported this new letter culture differed from that of the late Empire, but the habit of maintaining wide networks of communication looked similar. Roman influence also shaped architecture and art. Carolingians saw Roman, and more broadly Mediterranean, forms as appropriate to their new status. This could be seen in small objects, such as reliquaries designed like miniature triumphal arches, and in large-scale buildings. Charlemagne reused marbles and columns from Ravenna and took inspiration from its church of San Vitale when building his palace chapel at Aachen. Other sites in the empire, such as Paderborn, were sometimes described as New Romes. Rome stood not only for the classical past, but also for papal authority and the Christian memory of Peter and Paul. When the abbot of Fulda decided to build a great church to honor Boniface, he took the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome as his model. Even the production of Bibles shows that neither Rome nor the Bible was a single, fixed thing. In the mid-9th century, scribes at Tours produced large one-volume Bibles in a refined form of Caroline script, carefully arranged and corrected. Other centers copied separate biblical books or gospel collections and developed their own rich styles of decoration. The most luxurious manuscripts were usually gospel books, with brightly colored miniatures and elaborate initials. Workshops at different courts and monasteries created distinctive schools of illumination, some influenced by antique or Byzantine models, others more experimental. Manuscripts such as the Utrecht Psalter later inspired artists in places like Canterbury, spreading Carolingian visual ideas beyond the Frankish world. Book production lay at the core of the Carolingian revival, but it was not limited to Bibles and liturgical works. Learned monks and clerics wrote and copied theology, commentaries, encyclopedias, saints' lives, poetry, moral treatises, and school texts. Centers such as Fulda and Reichenau became especially important. Debates over doctrine, such as disputes about predestination involving Gottschalk and John Scotus Eriugena, show how lively intellectual life could be, even if final decisions often depended as much on powerful bishops like Hincmar of Reims as on pure argument. History writing also flourished under Carolingian rule. From the mid-8th century onwards, members of the ruling family sponsored continuations of older chronicles. Some early works clearly served as propaganda, portraying the Carolingians as chosen by God. Later, various sets of annals recorded events year by year, while other writers produced longer narratives and biographies of kings. The Life of Charlemagne, written by Einhard, and later works on Louis the Pious and Charles the Bald, show how royal lives became part of the cultural landscape. Carolingian culture was not confined to Francia. Rome kept its own long traditions, especially in church building and mosaics that echoed earlier 6th and 7th century models. Italy, more broadly, had its own rich artistic heritage, including Lombard architecture and sculpture, stucco decoration, and wall painting in places like Brescia, Cividale, and the Alpine region show both continuity and innovation. In language, too, there was a complex picture. Spoken Latin continued to change and diverge regionally, gradually turning into early forms of Romance languages, while the educated elite increasingly used a more standardized, grammatically correct Latin taught in schools. This widened the gap between written and spoken language. The cultural program also had consequences for the use of Germanic languages. As churchmen east of the Rhine tried to instruct non-Latin speakers, they began to write religious texts in local dialects. Old English legal texts and scriptural paraphrases appeared in England. In the Frankish world, biblical and liturgical words were glossed and translated. By the 9th century, substantial Christian works in Old Saxon and Old High German were being composed, including poetic retellings of Genesis and of the Gospel story, as well as a gospel harmony by Ottfried of Weissenburg. Secular heroic poems were also recorded, though only fragments survive, such as the Hildebrandslide and, later, the Ludwigslide, about a battle against Vikings. The impact of Carolingian culture thus spread across and beyond the empire. It may have influenced court life in Asturias, and certainly reached the British Isles. Frankish churchmen took part in synods in England, and Carolingian ideas about reform and education echoed in English church councils. Some English manuscripts show clear Carolingian stylistic influence, and metalwork and other arts also absorbed elements of the new classical style. At the same time, the great insular tradition continued, and the precise relationship between the Carolingian Renaissance and 9th century English cultural achievements is still not fully understood, especially given the disruptions caused by Viking attacks. Although Norse raiders destroyed monasteries and caused widespread fear, their cultural influence during the 9th century was actually smaller than the earlier Germanic impact of the 5th and 6th centuries. They still formed new political powers in places like England and Ireland, and these new realms developed their own artistic languages. In northern England, stone carvings can be grouped into two clear phases, one before the Scandinavian arrival and another after. The older carvings show flowing vines and interlace patterns, while later work favors rough animal shapes and warrior imagery. Traditional stone crosses continued to appear, but their decoration began to show figures from Norse legend. New burial monuments, known today as hogbacks, also became common at this time. Some of what we know about Viking courts comes from sagas written centuries later, though they sometimes preserve older praise poems for early kings. Raiding also meant valuable objects from Anglo-Saxon and Carolingian lands were carried back into Scandinavia. Efforts to convert the Danes and increased contact with the German realm pushed places like Jelling to adopt many Frankish cultural elements. In England, most early kingdoms fell apart, yet Wessex remained strong. Its survival depended heavily on a renewal of learning and religion under King Alfred, 871 to 899. Alfred believed divine support and protection came from proper worship and knowledge, so he encouraged education and insisted that clergy supervise moral life closely. Books he considered essential were translated into English so more people could read them, including works by Gregory the Great, Orosius, Bede, and Boethius. His program built a foundation for English writing that reached its high point in the sermons of Elfric, who died in 1025. Even though Alfred saved Wessex, the unification of all England was achieved by later rulers, especially Athelstan, 924 to 939. Creating one kingdom required more than military victories. A key part of the process was the movement of saints' relics from northern shrines to southern churches. Relics represented both the Christian heritage remembered through Bede's history and the identities of different regions. When relocation was impossible, as in the case of Saint Cuthbert, rulers instead showed respect through rich gifts such as decorated manuscripts. A wide religious renewal that first grew strong in places like Cluny, Gorze, and Fleury also reached England. One of its leading English figures, Ethelwold of Winchester, re-established strict monastic rules and helped make Winchester a major center of book production. Under King Edgar, beautiful biblical manuscripts and grand liturgical books were created there. The architectural style of the Old Minster, especially its powerful western tower, reflected older Carolingian influences, signaling Winchester's importance in the New English kingdom. West Francia and Lotharingia played a central role in this movement, and their monasteries produced respected writers. One well-known scholar was Abbot of Fleury, who led a monastery and wrote saints' biographies. Cathedral schools also became important centers of study, particularly in Reims under Archbishop Gerbert, who later became pope as Sylvester II and influenced the reforming ambitions of Emperor Otto III. The Ottonian family rose from Saxon lands on the eastern edge of the old Carolingian territories. Their culture had a strong regional base, with planned settlements like Magdeburg marking eastern expansion. New churches and monasteries were built, and the church at Gernrode remains an outstanding example. Yet the Ottonians also turned toward traditional Carolingian centers of power. Otto I placed his brother Bruno in Cologne as archbishop, and the Empress Theophano, widow of Otto II, sponsored major building projects there. Aachen, Charlemagne's old capital, became especially meaningful. Otto III honored Charlemagne deeply, even opening his tomb around the year 1000. The Ottonians followed the Carolingian path by seeking authority in Italy and Rome, and in 962 Otto I was crowned emperor. Their style absorbed Byzantine elements as well, since Theophano was related to the Eastern imperial family. The historian Liutprand, however, described Byzantium with hostility, showing the tension behind this cultural exchange. Otto III dreamed of renewing Rome, but died in 1002 after being driven from the city. Still, his circle helped spark a new flowering of art and learning that continued under Henry II. Their scriptoria produced luxurious illustrated books, richly covered and filled with gold. These works echoed Carolingian styles, but developed more narrative scenes and a distinct visual language. The Ottonian world placed strong emphasis on the suffering and kingship of Christ. Relics connected with the Passion, such as the Holy Lance, were treated as imperial treasures. When Otto III's body returned to Cologne during Holy Week in 1002, the ceremonies mirrored the story of Christ's final days. This devotion appeared in painted manuscripts, towering crucifixes, and new liturgical forms. Music changed dramatically. New chants, sequences, and tropes were created in centers like Reichenau, Liège, St. Gallen, and Winchester. Notation systems multiplied, and organs and other instruments became more common. Early forms of sacred drama also appeared, especially during ceremonies like Holy Week. Members of the Ottonian dynasty, both male and female, supported learning and sponsored manuscripts. Writers dedicated works such as Widukind's Chronicle to them. Yet they did not build a large educational system like the Carolingians. Instead, they relied mainly on a few monasteries, Reichenau, Corvey, and Fulda, to produce their finest books. Their cultural revival was therefore narrower, but still powerful. Both Carolingians and Ottonians imagined themselves restoring a Christian empire shaped by Rome and Scripture. Through reforms in monasteries, scholarship, worship, and education, they helped weave intellectual threads across Western Europe, creating moments of unity within a world filled with diversity. The ruling elite of Byzantium still carried the memory of their empire's former greatness and were reluctant to honor neighboring peoples they considered uncivilized. Even well-educated diplomats were not encouraged to write detailed descriptions of foreign societies. After the age of Justinian, such writings became rare, and this change reflects a deeper shift in Eastern Christian thought. Earlier Greek tradition valued observation, reasoning, and careful study of the physical world, but this attitude weakened. In the 6th century, Cosmas argued that the world was not a sphere, insisting instead that the sky was stretched over a flat earth like a canopy. His way of thinking rejected evidence and became influential among Eastern scholars. As this mindset spread, Byzantine writers grew even less willing to describe cultures outside their own system. Foreign rulers were often dismissed as illegitimate or temporary, and many scholars feared that too much curiosity about outsiders might lead to accusations of disloyalty. Despite official caution, some scholars who traveled on embassies to Muslim lands exchanged ideas privately. One such figure, known as John the Grammarian, may have gained access to astronomical information during diplomatic work in the East. Yet none of this appeared in official written accounts, which usually focused on defending Orthodox doctrine and criticizing Islam. This stood in contrast to late Roman writers such as Priscus and Menander, who recorded vivid reports from barbarian courts. Priscus described life among Attila's followers, repeating conversations with merchants and chiefs who openly compared Roman and nomad ways of life. These stories sometimes portrayed foreigners as honorable and Roman society as corrupt, using outsiders to reflect on the empire's own flaws. Menander later wrote about dealings with Turkish leaders in a similar way. Such writing was possible when the empire still held confidence and strength. By the mid-6th century, writers like Agathias still boasted that Roman travelers could move freely across the earth because the emperor's authority stretched far. Soon afterward, that confidence faded. Imperial biographies lost their impact, and diplomats no longer wrote lively narratives about encounters with foreign powers. The issue was not lack of contact, but loss of certainty. By the 10th century, information about borderlands continued to reach Constantinople, but these reports were intended mainly for military planning and were kept within the palace. The emperor was expected to possess knowledge that others did not. The few surviving surveys of foreign peoples written in this period came from emperors themselves. Constantine VII created a detailed manual for his heir describing various nations, their customs, climates, and the dangers or benefits they posed to Byzantium. He drew on older accounts from Priscus and Menander as well as newer reports, though the material was uneven and the final result often disorganized. Large events, such as the expansion of Arab rule in the Mediterranean, received little structure, showing how difficult it was to connect old sources with new information. Even so, the work reveals how an attentive ruler viewed the world. Constantine described northern groups such as the Hungarians, Khazars, and Rus in greater detail because they threatened imperial lands directly. The Rus were treated as a special danger since they could approach Constantinople by sea, unless the emperor kept the Pechenegs friendly. Peoples who only troubled border regions were given less space. His picture of the world shows a defensive empire surrounded by scattered raiders and shifting alliances, monitored from strategic positions like Crimea and Armenia. Missionaries worked among groups such as the Alans, and foreign rulers sometimes visited Constantinople for baptism. Yet these real interactions did not fit neatly into Constantine's ideal image of universal Roman authority, so they were often left out of his written survey. One Western observer, Liutprand of Cremona, viewed the empire differently. He described the Greeks with a mixture of admiration and distance, praising their piety and the magnificence of the imperial palace. His writing covered the Mediterranean world, its Christian powers, and the raids of Muslim forces. Yet he wrote as an outsider, speaking to fellow Western readers who knew little about Byzantium. By his time, travel between East and West had become more dangerous due to Hungarian attacks on land routes and the Muslim control of many sea passages, including Crete and parts of southern Italy. Contacts never disappeared, but they became harder and less frequent. It is within this setting that Liutprand expressed curiosity toward Byzantium, but also frustration when diplomatic aims failed, especially when he sought a marriage alliance for Otto I and was rejected. Afterward, he mocked Greek fashion and customs, contrasting them with the simpler warrior culture of his Saxon patrons. Other writers in the Christian West wrote from more scattered centers. They did not form a single literary tradition like that of Constantinople. Their works varied widely, but most shared a Christian worldview shaped by scripture and early church teaching. Orosius produced one of the first Christian interpretations of world history, arguing that human suffering began with sin rather than the rise of Christianity. He kept the classical division of the world into 3 parts and described the Mediterranean most clearly, leaving the distant barbarian lands vague. Northern readers later copied his work because it helped them locate themselves in the wider Christian narrative, even though their own regions barely appeared in it. Isidore of Seville later expanded this effort, gathering knowledge from many older sources and explaining the natural world through Christian meaning. He offered clear diagrams of earth, sky, and seasons so that people with few books could still understand creation. His writings did not encourage speculation, but they gave readers a portable guide to interpreting unfamiliar places and events. Bede, working far away in northern England, drew from these traditions. His history told how English peoples converted from paganism to Christianity over generations. He emphasized that unity was not guaranteed and that many kings could have chosen different paths. Bede praised the victory of Roman Christian practice over Celtic alternatives and saw his age as one in which distant journeys for missionary work or pilgrimage were acts of devotion. He described priests who crossed the sea to preach among Germanic tribes, sometimes suffering death for their mission. Travel was not only practical movement, but also spiritual struggle. This idea appeared in stories from many lands, where wandering for Christ was seen as a holy calling. Despite dangerous travel and the decline of Mediterranean trade, devotion to pilgrimage and evangelization increased. Missionaries traveled through northern lands, risking hardship and hoping for martyrdom. Others went to Rome or Jerusalem to honor sacred sites. The papacy served as a spiritual center for rulers seeking guidance, though Rome did not organize systematic missionary programs. The influence of the papacy grew gradually, supported by the prestige of relics and canon law rather than direct control. Charlemagne later imagined his realm as a new Christian unity. He expanded his territory, corresponded with distant rulers, and sponsored missions to Scandinavia. Scholars at his court attempted to describe the world more accurately. They calculated time, charted geography, and recorded news from far regions. Later, King Alfred of Wessex continued this curiosity, asking a Norwegian sailor named Otere to describe northern seas and peoples. Interest in exploration and knowledge grew alongside traditional piety, combining respect for holy places with fascination for unknown lands. Carolingian Europe was not sealed off. Trade moved through river routes to the Baltic and beyond. Scandinavian traders and raiders learned the coasts well and exchanged weapons, silver, and slaves. Even Viking attacks show how valuable European goods were to outsiders. Some Scandinavian leaders accepted baptism, sometimes out of genuine belief, sometimes to gain political advantage. Harold Bluetooth converted after witnessing what he believed was a miracle, and he later strengthened his rule with Christian symbols and fortifications. Similar changes occurred in Poland and Hungary, where rulers saw Christianity as a path to greater authority and recognition. The Rus, ruling along river networks to the Black Sea, also balanced between pagan traditions and Christian influence. Their princess Olga was baptized in Constantinople and later requested missionaries from Otto, though early attempts failed. Her grandson Vladimir at first tried to establish his own state religion, but resistance convinced him to look outward. After studying the practices of various monotheistic peoples, he finally accepted Christianity from Byzantium in exchange for military support and an imperial bride. This brought not only priests, but also builders, artists, and coin makers, linking the Rus more closely to the Eastern Christian world. With the Rus leaders becoming Christian around 988, other ambitious outsiders had even more reason to join the religion of those who seemed to be winning. Commanders of large war bands in Scandinavia could now treat the spread of Christianity as part of what it meant to be a real ruler. One example is Olaf Tryggvason. After being baptized following his campaigns in England in the mid-1990s, he returned to Norway and tried to force both his own power and the Christian faith on his people at the same time. All this happened while ideas about order, rank, and authority were also changing very quickly. In this setting, Otto III appears as a kind of intense experiment. In him, we see several things at once: a push to make imperial power more visible in Italy, the spiritual passion of a very clever young man who mixed personal concern for his own salvation with the religious energy of monks and scholars, and a deliberate turn toward symbolism and holy connections at a time when military conquest no longer promised big gains. These sides of him do not clash with each other. It is normal that a ruler who died at 21 would act with strong and shifting emotions. Otto used both ancient signs of sacred and imperial order, and at the same time tried to recognize the ambitions of new elites forming in the east and the north. He gave attention not only to older centers such as Rome and Aachen, but also to rising powers like Venice and Poland. Through these links and gestures, he hoped to hold the German lands together within a wider network. When Otto first came to Rome in 996, the city itself was not his main goal. What really mattered to him was securing the papal office for his cousin, who became Gregory V. Otto wanted a pope he could rely on to help sort out church disputes in many places, from Reims to Prague and the bishoprics beyond the Elbe. But in order to keep this cooperation, he had to get deeply involved in Roman politics. In 998, he removed a rival pope, had him mutilated, and executed his chief supporter, John Crescentius, who held the powerful urban title of city prefect. By the end of the 990s, Otto was trying to build a special bond with Rome. He took up residence on the Palatine Hill, where the old imperial palaces had once stood, and organized grand ceremonies that echoed ancient imperial style. This was a direct challenge to older ideas that linked the city to other kinds of authority. The high ranks, titles, and marks of honor he gave to allies were aimed partly at impressing Roman society, showing that Otto now decided who was important in the city. He also promoted the Virgin Mary as Rome's heavenly protector and ordered hymns to be written in her honor. Some observers, like Bruno of Querfurt, criticized him for giving too much wealth and favor to the Romans above all others. At the same time, Otto used similar methods beyond the old imperial borders. His visit to Poland shows this clearly. He went to Gniezno to pray at the tomb of Adalbert, a missionary bishop he admired, who had been killed by pagan Prussians in 997. There, Otto declared that Gniezno should become an archbishop's seat and exchanged rich gifts with the Polish ruler, Bolesław. By recognizing a separate archbishopric, Otto helped to shape Poland into a more clearly defined Christian kingdom. In another ceremony, he gave Bolesław a copy of the sacred spear and placed his own crown on Bolesław's head, calling him a brother and partner in imperial affairs. For rulers on the edges of Europe, such treatment gave them what they wanted: royal status and church structure. Otto could not stop these new powers from growing, but he could try to guide and bless their rise by granting crowns and holy symbols from his own hand. In the year 1000, Otto sent a crown and a gilded spear to Stephen, the Hungarian ruler, whose people had once been a serious threat to the empire. He also supported the creation of a new archbishopric for the Hungarian lands. These actions became more meaningful because they were carried out with the help of his new pope, Gerbert, who took the name Sylvester. No pope had used that name since the time of Constantine the Great, and the choice hinted that Otto wanted to be seen as a second Constantine. Documents from 1001 and around that time describe Otto as the faithful supporter and spreader of the holy churches and as a servant of the apostles, stressing his role in missionary work. Otto's mixture of firm control in Rome and active involvement in spreading the faith was something new. It appealed to rulers who wanted to join the Christian political world, but also keep and strengthen their own power at home. Boleslav, described as a friend and ally of the Roman people, traveled with Otto to Aachen and watched him open Charlemagne's tomb. In this way, Otto used the prestige of the past and the hopes of up-and-coming leaders to build a kind of shared imperial vision based less on conquest and more on agreement, ritual, and mutual recognition. He was also negotiating a marriage with the Eastern Empire. In early 1002, a princess born in the purple arrived in Italy to marry him. Their union would have symbolized cooperation between the rulers of Rome and Constantinople, with any future children embodying that balance. Otto's sudden death, before he could meet her, ended this plan. The idea of Eastern and Western Christian emperors jointly presiding over old imperial centers and many distant peoples faded with him. Modern readers often treat the year 1000 as a sharp turning point, but people living at the time did not necessarily see it that way. For example, the English record of that year simply notes that the king led a destructive campaign in Cumberland, that his ships tried, but failed, to join him by sailing around to Chester, and that they instead raided the Isle of Man. It also mentions that enemy ships visited the lands of a certain foreign ruler that summer. By contrast, a monk named Ralph Glaber, writing a few decades later, did think the round number 1000 was meaningful and used it as a focus in his history. He wrote that around this time, people in Italy and Gaul began building churches on a large scale, as if the world were throwing off its old clothes and putting on a bright new covering of churches. He also said that many people traveled to Jerusalem, and that many important men, bishops, dukes, and counts, died around then. Yet, when we compare his statements to other evidence, his dates are rough, and some of the people he lists actually died years later. For him, the symbolic meaning mattered more than exact timing. He thought the year 1033, 1,000 years after the Passion of Christ, was even more important. Ralph also believed that after 1000, especially in Italy and Gaul, new types of laymen and churchmen appeared whose lives were worth following as examples. He saw his own time as building on, but also standing apart from, what came before. Other writers of the 11th and 12th centuries shared this sense of connection to the past. Many of them started their accounts by retelling events from earlier centuries, sometimes going back as far as the 5th or even earlier. They also copied and reused older histories, such as biographies of early rulers and accounts of former peoples. In their minds, they owed a great deal to the scholars and leaders of the early medieval and Carolingian years, and they respectfully listed them among their intellectual ancestors. The achievements of rulers from the early medieval period, especially their conversions to Christianity and their support for the faith, continued to inspire later leaders. Otto III had already opened Charlemagne's tomb, but it was Emperor Frederick Barbarossa in 1165 who arranged for Charlemagne to be recognized formally as a saint, after which a liturgical cult in his honor spread widely. From Otto I onward, up until the early 16th century, 30 German rulers were crowned in Aachen, underlining the lasting pull of Carolingian memory. By contrast, some modern historians have drawn too simple a picture of the early 11th century, speaking in very broad terms about chaos and sudden change, often based mainly on events in limited parts of France. In reality, a complicated political, social, religious, and legal system cannot be transformed overnight. Differences between regions already existed in the 9th century. For example, the Eastern Frankish kingdom used fewer royal laws and minted less coinage than the Western kingdom. In some places, like Eastern Francia and in England, royal leadership actually became stronger in response to outside attacks, such as those of the Magyars or the Viking armies. Still, there were real changes alongside elements of continuity. Around the year 1000 and in the decades that followed, aristocratic power became more clearly defined and more closely tied to military organization, local control, and legal structures. These developments affected the strength and reach of central rulers. As one historian has pointed out, local power blocks became the basic pieces out of which later more centralized governments were built in the 12th century. This process took time, and even in kingdoms like England and Germany, where older traditions were stronger, similar shifts took place over roughly the next 100 years. In this sense, the period around 1000 is a reasonable place to pause when looking at political and social history in Western Europe, because from then on, any layman, peasant, or churchman had to reckon with the firm reality of local noble power. Long-term economic growth around this time is also important. Scholars have noted that we must look over many centuries to see how medieval economic institutions evolved, especially since written evidence is uneven. The same is true of religious change. Later reformers in the 11th century believed they were sweeping away the decay of earlier times, but this view was part of their own self-presentation and should not be taken at face value. Deep roots of reform ideas, practices, and tensions stretch back well before 1000. In fact, the close connection between sacred and secular life in the early Middle Ages provided a strong base from which later reforms could grow once people began to redraw the lines between those two spheres. The reign of Otto III can be seen as the last expression of an older pattern, even as new conditions were emerging. Europe was sending out branches in many directions: religious, political, and cultural. Missionary activity continued in the East. In 1008, Bruno of Querfurt, who had once criticized Otto's love for Rome, set out to convert the Pechenegs, whom he saw as especially fierce pagans. He assumed that the land of the Rus, at the edge of which he began his journey into the steppe, was now Christian. Newly formed kingdoms on Europe's borders served as launch pads for taking Christianity even farther. At that time, Eastern churchmen were still seen as part of this broad Christian effort, not as strangers. In the mid-11th century, Armenian bishops worked in Iceland, and there were small churches in Greenland, though not in the short-lived Scandinavian settlements on the North American coast. While some of the first churches were being built in Greenland, other signs of change were visible further south. Near the end of the 10th century, a report claims that many merchants from Amalfi were killed in Cairo. The exact number may be exaggerated, but the story shows that Italian traders were active deep within the Nile region. They had already set up a base in Constantinople earlier in the century. Around the same time, a formal document granted commercial privileges to Venetian merchants and to the goods carried in their ships. This tells us that more and more people wanted access to the markets of Constantinople, and that Venetian fleets were becoming important, not only as traders but also as potential carriers of troops. Trade remained limited in scale and mostly passed through middlemen from cities such as Amalfi and Venice, but the pattern is clear. Small groups of merchants, adventurers, and pilgrims, often competing with each other, would drive much of the activity in the Mediterranean. Although Europe was divided into many rival power groups, it was also tied together by shared beliefs, customs, and values. By the end of the 10th century, forces were forming that no emperor could fully control. These energies would soon press outward against Muslim-ruled Sicily and Spain, and would eventually affect Byzantium itself. The broader story of this long period is one of many separate developments that slowly interacted and combined. Over roughly 6 centuries, the Latin Christian world extended its horizons and constantly met other peoples and lands. It created a landscape that was both varied and connected. To understand these centuries properly, we need to study politics, society, economy, religion, and culture together, and always keep in mind the limits of our evidence. With all the breaks and continuities described, this era was crucial for what came later. It was during the early Middle Ages that the foundations of the Europe we know today were laid.